Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso and I'm excited to be with you to talk about a new exposure draft that's come out of the GASB related to certain risk disclosures. So as you can probably imagine, state and local governments are not immune to a normal amount of risk that could impact their ability to provide services or their ability to pay bills as they become due. However, there is some requirements around potential risks that are required, but a lot of information is actually not explicitly required in the current standards. And so once we saw some of the impact on governments for COVID-19 and other areas, the FASB has a set of guidance on risk and uncertainty disclosures, but GASB did not. The GASB decided they wanted to take a look at what would be appropriate, obviously, for state and local governments in this area. And so they picked up with a GASB focus for state and local governments, what would be appropriate. So this was issued in June of 2022. Comments are due September 30th. And the goal here is to provide users with what they consider to be essential information about risks. So what is it? Again, we talked about the note disclosures and the updates that were done to the conceptual framework. What is essential? And again, this is around current vulnerabilities due to concentrations and constraints. And again, this is going to help improve financial reporting to give people sort of these early warning signals. Hey, this is a certain concentration or this is a certain constraint that could, have an ability for us to impact our ability to provide services or potentially to meet our obligations. And so we want to provide users with that level of detail. And so this standard is designed to provide financial reporting requirements for governments exposed to risk from those concentrations and those constraints that are common in the government environment, right? So they're really looking at it from the lens of state and local governments, what would be appropriate here. And again, if you're doing a comparative financial statement, it would obviously only apply to the current period because risk can change from year to year. So your current period risks are what we're going to focus on from a disclosure perspective. So first off, we're going to look at concentrations, and these are a lack of sufficient diversity related to an aspect of revenue or expense. And so governments obviously are exposed to these concentrations because there's a lack of diversity, right? They're dependent on one type of revenue source, and if that revenue source were to leave, right, what would happen? Or they get their expense from a particular vendor and all of it comes from one vendor. Should that vendor stop providing that expense, where would they go? And so this could limit their ability to acquire resources or control spending, because that person could then increase their expenses significantly. And if that's the only vendor producing it, you would have to pay it. And so again, when we think about these, it could be principal employers, right? So when we think about the types of taxes that we collect from employers, if they were to leave and no longer be an employer in your district, well, what would that impact on revenue be? Certain industries, if there's a problem in a particular industry and revenue goes down significantly for that industry, how would that impact it? Principal resource providers, principal inflows of resources, potentially worker related items, especially if they have a collective bargaining agreement and they can demand more. Suppliers of materials, labors, or services. So again, these are just examples. This is not what it's limited to, but these are just examples of the types of concentrations that could impact a governmental entity. There are also potentially constraints, right? This is a limitation imposed on a government by an external party or by formal action of the government's highest level decision-making authority. And so these are also risks that control their ability to acquire resources. And so constraints can be external or internal. For example, limits on raising revenue, right? You can't exceed a certain percentage. Or limitations on spending or incurrence of debt, right? We have a debt maximum that's in our debt agreements, or mandated spending. And so these are the types of constraints and concentrations that they want to focus on. So again, a little bit different than the FASB version of the standard, but looking at it through that governmental lens. And so if you have these significant constraints or concentrations, then you're going to require disclosures. So again, there's not just mandatory disclosures. The disclosures are required if you meet the criteria. So not every government will meet the criteria for every possible constraint or concentration. So you have to have a constraint or concentration, first off, that's known prior to issuance. An event associated with the concentration or constraint either occurred or is more likely than not to occur within 12 months of the financial statements or shortly thereafter. And it is at least reasonably certain that within a 3-year period of the financial statement date, so that's a look forward period, the event will cause there to be a substantial effect on the government's ability to either continue to provide services or meet the obligations. So again, it's not automatic, oh, I have a constraint, let me go look at my disclosures. Is there a known constraint? Is there an event associated with it that's more likely than not to happen? And then is it at least reasonably possible that within the 3 years that would lead to? So it's a very, very narrow proposal. I'm actually a tiny bit disappointed with it because it's so narrow that I think things that would be really interesting will not be required to be disclosed as a result of it, because it's not going to meet one of these 3 criteria. So while there's a known constraint, it meets the first one, you have to meet all of the following criteria. So the second or third, some of these constraints will not be disclosed as a result. In addition, if there is some mitigating action that causes it to no longer meet the criteria, then you don't have to do the disclosure. So maybe you had a disclosure last year, that disclosure can go away because of some mitigating action that you took, then the disclosure is no longer required. You also want to make sure that you're providing with enough detail so the users can understand the item, and so what level of services are able to be provided or how it's going to impact your ability to meet them. And so what disclosure is required? Well, a description of the concentration or constraint, and then for each event associated with the concentration, right, what event has occurred or is more likely than not to begin within 12 months. And then again, describing it is at least reasonably possible that within 3 years it would have that impact. So then that would explain how we kind of got there. Now, as we look at this, you would also want to take a definition or a description of any actions taken prior to the issuance that would have mitigated the substantial effect as well. And so this would be for both the primary government as well as any blended component units would be the proposed disclosure. In terms of effective date, it would be for statements for fiscal years beginning after June 15, 2023, so which would be fiscal and calendar 24. So there's also a little bit of a longer runway before we would have this be effective, because again, this is just a proposal. They are going to take feedback, so if you think the criteria needs to be adjusted or the disclosure needs to be adjusted, I am sure that the GASB would love to hear from you. And so again, we have until the end of September to provide this feedback to GASB so that when they issue a final standard, they have heard the needs of citizens and users of those financial statements. So I want to thank you guys so much for joining me this week on the Genuine Learning blog, and I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.